On August 12, 1953, the Soviet Union set off the world's first fully functional, weapons-ready hydrogen bomb. This was 6 months, give or take, before the United States had its own H-bomb ready to test. You could quibble with that figure and say that the Americans had set off an H-bomb test several months earlier, but it was not a deliverable weapon. The fact is, the Soviets got there first. It was a terrible moment, not just a blow to American pride and a worrisome glimpse of Soviet military advancement, but it also seemed so impossible. Americans presumed themselves to be innately superior at science and technology, not because they were smarter, but because the infrastructure of American society, with its democratic freedoms and capitalist economy, made it so. The evil empire was evil because their society was built wrong, built in ways that would inevitably thwart innovation and accomplishment. At least, this is how the story was told, and if the commies had pulled ahead in the H-bomb arms race, it challenged the basic assumptions of that story. The H-bomb arms race, though, was a marathon of prodigious dimensions, with plenty of time for multiple reversals of fate. At any given point, one or the other side would appear ahead from their own vantage point, while the rest of the world watched anxiously as the two sides, neck and neck, continued to barrel on heedlessly towards total annihilation. In the early 1950s, as these prototype H-bombs were first being tried out, nobody yet knew what the consequences would be. There were self-anointed experts who claimed to know, but their various pronouncements on the relative safety or danger of radioactive fallout and blast exposure would all prove to be nuttier than any science fiction. To the average person, all that was certain was that our scientists were playing with fire. We could destroy all life on Earth many times over. That was the given. That we knew. That was indeed the point. Anything else was up for grabs. So the average person would feel naturally inclined to view science as dangerous. Too much knowledge is a bad thing. We've encroached on God's domain. Invoke the stereotype of your own choosing here. Icarus flying too close to the sun, Prometheus stealing the technology of the gods, Frankenstein unleashing a monster. But at the same time, with the Soviets pulling ahead with their first H-bomb, with Sputnik, with their successful work putting people into space, the average American also instinctively felt that their nation needed more science, and fast. And this was the essential paradox that gripped Americans in the 1950s, an unresolvable tension between irreconcilable and incompatible positions. Science is bad, and we need more of it. Science creates wonders. Those wonders will kill us. Unable to resolve this tension in the real world, how could you? The next best thing was to resolve it in fantasy, to create a space in popular culture where this tension could be dramatized and solutions found. Fictional, perhaps, but no less cathartic for it. This was the origin of 1950s science fiction, a way to revel in the wondrous glories of technological advancement, while also demonizing those very things. Ray guns, spaceships, giant mutants, mad scientists, moviegoers couldn't get enough of the stuff. On April 27, 1956, a film premiered in the United States that depicted these things. Its scientist heroes were heroic and inventive, yet morally conflicted by their own discoveries. A horrible monster had been created by H-bomb tests, yet to vanquish it threatened to send that arms race into a new, even worse spiral. For audiences in the U.S., this was a kind of science fiction that hit very close to home. Those audiences made it into a hit so massive that it changed the very language itself. Where would we be without the suffix Zilla, the universal signifier of the gargantuan? Hello, my name is David Kalat, and my book, A Critical History and Filmography of Toho's Godzilla series, is available from McFarland & Company Press. And I'm going to be your guide through this film and its companion original version, Godzilla.
Dead and dying in the ruins around me. When I think back,
that original version had been crafted for the Japanese market in 1954. This version appeared 2 years later, adapted for the American market, and much of what we will discuss here concerns that process of Americanization and the underlying logic behind it. For example, we are now entering a flashback that will dominate nearly the entire running time of the film. The opening sequence, in which the reporter was discovered in rubble and taken to a hospital, used footage taken from very near the end of the original Japanese cut. This edition of the film begins after Godzilla's second and final attack on Tokyo. Nearly the entire story is set in the film's own past. It's a punchy way to start a movie and establishes an apocalyptic atmosphere right from the first frames. Yet despite these strengths, it was, and still is, a fairly unusual structure for a science fiction thriller. Most of the monster-on-the-loose flicks that would clutter American drive-ins in the wake of this film would opt for the same linear storytelling structure that the Japanese cut had, a gradual introduction of a mystery, ultimately leading to monster mayhem in the final reels. Of all the things Godzilla copycats took from this film, the flashback structure wasn't one of them. It is possible that the filmmakers took some inspiration from Invasion of the Body Snatchers earlier the same year, which also begins at the end and unfolds most of its plot in flashback. None of the filmmakers ever made specific reference to Body Snatchers as a touchstone, so I'll put forth another possibility for the flashback's origins. It came from film noir. 1940s crime thrillers often used flashback setups because it was a convenient trick for cash-strapped, low-budget productions to get around things they couldn't afford to show. A story narrated in past tense by one of the characters, as this one is by Raymond Burr, can tell the audience about scenes the filmmakers couldn't afford to shoot, and can establish certain moods and ideas just by saying them, which might have been otherwise complicated to present visually. The man chiefly responsible for turning the Japanese Godzilla into the American Godzilla King of the Monsters was Terrell O. Morse, a director and editor with a strong background in low-budget crime dramas. By beginning Godzilla King of the Monsters in this way, Morse starts off by showing us the near destruction of Tokyo, the irradiation of its citizens, the certain doom of innocent children, and the near death of our ostensible main character and central point of identification, Raymond Burr. That's grim. It's a doom-laden setup that hangs over the rest of the film, an inevitable and nasty fate. That's a film noir setup. Noir is also what's signaled by the casting of Raymond Burr. And Burr was a big man, very tall, and in his earlier screen appearances was even heavier. So you had a man with an imposing physique, big, soulful eyes, and a voice as soft as cotton. It made him distinctive, but he wasn't your typical leading man. He got some early roles as gangsters and bad guys, and since he was very talented and professional, he nailed those roles, which tended to typecast him. Movie after movie, Burr was stuck playing bad guys, in supporting roles mostly, and longing for a breakthrough into a more sympathetic part. To cast him as the reporter hero involved casting against type, and this performance would be one of those transitional roles that helped Burr break out of his bad guy rut. The legend goes that Burr shot all of his scenes in one day. In fact, Terry Morse rented space at the Visual Drama Studios for 5 days, and Burr was on set for 3 of those. But even so, a 3-day shoot is crazy short, and it speaks to Morse's exceptional preparation that they could do what they needed to do in so short a time. Morse's task was to watch the original version carefully while consulting an English translation of the screenplay to figure out how to reconfigure its constituent pieces to create the illusion of Raymond Burr interacting with the rest of the cast. According to his son, Terry Morse Jr., who is also a film editor, Morse Sr. was so smitten by the original version of the film that he kept that copy intact in his own personal collection ever since. The decision was made to cast Burr as a reporter, a character who would logically be on the sidelines of the action, watching and commenting on things, an ever-present witness whose presence is justified even if he doesn't personally take action. There was a reporter character in the original cut, and given the similarity of narrative functions, that character is mostly removed from this version to make way for his American counterpart. George Rohr was responsible for assembling mock-ups of some of the original sets, so that Burr and his fellow actors at Visual Drama could appear to stand in the same rooms as the Japanese cast. For example, here, the left-hand wall next to the entry door of the central headquarters of the steamship company, where Ogata works, has been recreated so that Raymond Burr and Akira Takarada can share the same room, even if they don't share and cannot share the same frame. The process of adding a character to an already finished film and appending Morse's name as director to a work that had already existed as Ishiro Honda's work is not as unprecedented as it may seem. Since the 1920s, Hollywood had been in the practice of screening films for preview audiences, whose reactions were used to make adjustments to those films. If a movie tanked at the preview, it could undergo significant revision. New scenes shot, endings changed, sometimes entire characters dropped and actors recast. Sometimes a film started to get into trouble long before the preview stage, and that's when you call in the film doctor. As the name implies, a film doctor is the fellow you turn to when your film is sick. He's the guy who comes in and reshoots and re-edits as needed to turn a disaster into something the producer might actually be able to sell. Notice also that evidently this sort of thing happened with enough frequency that Hollywood felt the need to have a recognized term for it. Terrell O. Morse was a film doctor, experienced in rescuing wayward productions. His skill was editing. Not a lot of directors were also trained editors, so Morse's talent was knowing in a very specific and granular way what could be done to a film's existing footage to make something different out of it. That gives you some idea of how this came to be. But as for why, that gets more complicated. Soichi Oya was a Japanese intellectual, journalist, essayist, iconoclastic activist. His name is still revered as one of the key thinkers of post-war Japan. In the early 1950s, he was traveling the world to get a sense of Japan's public image. This was important to him for obvious reasons. His country had recently waged war on the world. A great many people had first-hand experience with Japanese aggression. Some had experienced wartime atrocities. Those who didn't have personal stories of Japanese hostility had nevertheless marinated in years' worth of wartime anti-Japanese propaganda. If his homeland was going to rehabilitate its tattered PR and join the international community as a respected and admired place, that wartime image would have to be confronted, dismantled, and replaced. Country after country, Oya asked his question, "What do you think of Japan?" And time and again, he received the same response. "Rashomon! I love that movie!" Oya's heart sank. It was worse than he'd feared. Now, let's be clear. Oya had nothing against Rashomon. It's a terrific film, and it continues to stand as one of the great works of cinema. But Oya was not pleased that Japan's most recognizable pop cultural export was a film set in the feudal past. The medieval setting of it, and so many of Akira Kurosawa's acclaimed art films, placed the action in a fantasy vision of a distant past. Such images could do nothing to unmake the contemporary prejudices against Japan. Oya returned to Japan complaining loudly that the film industry needed to make a popularly accessible work set in the modern age. Meanwhile, the esteemed cinema journal Kinema Junpo inveighed against Rashomon as well. Again, let's be clear, they liked the movie just fine, but in 1952, Rashomon became the highest-grossing Japanese film ever shown in the United States. Okay? Now, its box office take was a miserly $200,000. I want you to do a spit take at that number. I want that number to hurt you, like it hurt the Kinema Junpo crowd. So let me add some context. Rashomon was an Oscar-nominated film. It had won the Golden Lion at the Venice Film Festival. It had been hailed by critics the world over as a masterpiece. It was distributed by RKO, which meant it had the publicity and distribution network of a major Hollywood studio, whereas most foreign films and other Japanese imports had been handled by independent companies with limited resources. And that $200,000 represented the accumulated earnings over 2 years. As pitiful as Rashomon's earnings were, it represented the high watermark for Japanese film in the U.S. The writers at Kinema Junpo fingered the culprit: subtitles. The reason Japanese films made such little headway into the U.S. market, they reasoned, was Americans don't like to read subtitles. The solution, then, was to insist that American distributors dub Japanese films instead. Across the ocean, a number of prominent American critics were saying the same thing. The only theaters that were willing to show subtitled fare were clustered in urban areas. The vast majority of Americans didn't even have access to subtitled movies. The decision to subtitle a film was a decision that consigned that film to a limited release, from which a paltry $200,000 payday might be the best you could ever hope for. A number of foreign producers, especially in France, tried to band together to use the leverage of collective bargaining to force American distributors to dub their imports. The distributors balked. A decent dub job cost often 10 times as much as the going rates to license rights to a foreign films, whereas subtitling was inexpensive. Distributors were reluctant to undertake such additional costs except in situations where the movie in question seemed to have crossover potential. Only the most special of films deserved to be dubbed. In all of this, there was an independent-minded distributor who bucked the conventional wisdom and dared risk his money to dub films that seemed self-evidently art house fare. He believed that any film had the potential to reach any audience if promoted properly, and he was willing to put his money where his mouth was. His name was Joseph E. Levine, and in 1945 he dubbed Roberto Rossellini's Open City into English and opened it across the country. The rest of the film world laughed at his folly until Open City became the first foreign-made import in movie history to make over $1 million in the American market. Conventional wisdom had long held that foreign movies were too arty, too alien to reach mass audiences. Levine had challenged that logic, and he kept on doing it. He cracked that $1 million ceiling once more with Rossellini's next film, Paisan, and then he did it a third time with Bicycle Thieves in 1948. If you want to see Open City, Paisan, or Bicycle Thieves today, you will almost undoubtedly find them subtitled. Even tracking down a dubbed copy is virtually impossible. By modern lights, dubbing is an insult to a film. True movie lovers would always choose subtitles. But in the late 1940s and early 1950s, dubbing was a mark of the deepest respect, a sign that the distributor believed in the film so much that they were willing to increase their investment many times over. And by the mid-1950s, no one had yet shown a single Japanese film this kind of respect. And then came Godzilla. Godzilla accomplished what 1,000 Rashomons never could. It was a popular mainstream hit in the U.S., dubbed and accessible, that wormed its way into American popular consciousness without sacrificing its Japanese identity. The makers of Godzilla had not set out to make their film that cultural ambassador, but the film's blockbuster performance in Japan prompted them to look into foreign sales. Edmund Goldman bought the rights for the United States and Canada, for which he paid $25,000. At the time, the average license fee was $3,000, so while $25,000 may sound like Goldman got it for a song, which he really kinda did, he was paying almost 10 times the usual amount. That's confidence indeed. That confidence prompted Goldman to seek out some business partners, Harold Ross and Richard Kay, to help him finance the publicity. At this point, Goldman expected to merely subtitle the film, which was, of course, the cheapest option, and just wanted to make sure he promoted the hell out of it. But Ross and Kay thought there was more potential in the film, and they showed it to Joseph Levine. Levine was impressed by what he saw and agreed to invest $100,000 of his own to underwrite the Americanization of the film. Together, these investors called their partnership Trans World Enterprises, a company that existed for the sole purpose of marketing Godzilla in the U.S. At this point, the contours of the idea started to form. They weren't going to just dub it, as Levine had previously done, but make more substantial adaptations, including inserting an American character as narrator and audience identification figure. In fact, while critics often refer to this as a dubbed film, or as a badly dubbed film, it doesn't have much dubbing in it. Raymond Burr speaks English, as do the Asian-looking actors hired to play the characters he directly encounters, such as the security officer played by Frank Iwanaga. Meanwhile, several sequences are left in Japanese, with Iwanaga offering up on-demand translations. Anyone in the audience who did understand Japanese would be perplexed by these scenes because the Japanese text is treated like the adults in the Peanuts cartoons who just go wah, wah, wah instead of saying anything intelligible. It's just a noise that signals that someone is talking. Iwanaga's translations have nothing to do with what's actually being said. There's a vague whiff of racist condescension to that, the assumption that you could treat the Japanese dialogue as if it were inherently meaningless babble, and we see a similar problematic attitude in this sequence. Actor Ren Yamamoto plays the fisherman Masaji, the sole survivor of the second fishing boat we saw attacked. He washed up ashore a few scenes ago, and Raymond Burr's narration clearly said he died. But he didn't die in the original cut, not until Godzilla crushes him underfoot here. So he's in these scenes, and thus this film takes for granted that the viewer has such difficulty identifying one Japanese face from another that the audience won't be confused by a dead guy returning to life only to be killed a second time. The only dubbing that actually exists in this film occurs in those scenes where the Japanese main characters are alone. But maybe even then I'm misusing the word. Usually, when you say a movie is dubbed, what you're referring to is a process whereby voice actors are set before microphones while a short loop of the film is played, and they continue to voice the lines to that section over and over until they nail the synchronization with the lips. That's why the process is sometimes called looping. Well, that's not at all what they did with Godzilla. Here, voice actors were hired and placed in front of a mic, but with no film clips at all, just a script to read from. The actors didn't even know they were voicing lines for a movie that had already been made. They had no idea they were dubbing anything. For all they knew, they were recording voiceovers for a radio drama. Then, Morse just laid those audio clips into place as best as possible, and whether they fit at all was just a lucky accident. In the years since, commentators seeking to treat Godzilla with respect have fallen into the habit of doing so at the expense of this cut. The thinking seems to be, in order to make a claim that Honda's 1954 original deserves serious attention, you have to also smack down this cut as an embarrassment. Aaron Kerner, writing in the scholarly collection Ritual and Event, puts it this way. Quote, "The 1956 Godzilla King of the Monsters transforms Gojira into a run-of-the-mill science fiction film." William Tsutsui, associate professor of history at the University of Kansas, has been one of the more conspicuous Godzilla boosters among academia, and he voices a similar plaint. Quote, "Although Gojira was not exactly eviscerated in this transition, with the terrifying charm of the monster thankfully surviving the cinematic surgery, much of the emotional power, intellectual depth, social relevance, and visceral impact of Gojira was lost in its translation to U.S. movie screens." One of the prominent deletions that marks the difference between the two versions is that nearly all of the overt references to the A-bombs and H-bombs have been cut from the American edition. Now, this is not to say that the American cut changes any of the nuclear subtext. All of the subtext is still there. What's gone are the bits that were text, moments where characters made explicit mention of the bombing of Nagasaki, of the Bikini Island H-bomb tests, of the irradiation of Japanese tuna by American and Russian bomb tests. When asked whether these cuts were an intentional strategy of blunting the film's nuclear message, the filmmakers expressed bewilderment and surprise. They insist the nuclear message is fully intact, and as I said, the subtext is untouched. Nobody who saw this film in 1956 missed the point, and I'm willing to take Morse and his team at their word for this. For one thing, in 1951, Terry Morse directed a low-budget sci-fi B-movie called Unknown World, aimed at the same exploitation market that Godzilla later would be. And it's got an even more strident anti-nuke message than anything in Honda's original cut of Godzilla. Clearly, this filmmaker, Terry Morse, and this genre, and this American audience were all fully comfortable with a polemic at least as strong as the Japanese version of Godzilla. It's been suggested by some writers that maybe the reluctance that Morse et al. Might have felt towards the Godzilla H-bomb dialogue was something different than Unknown World because it constitutes an anti-American stance as much as an anti-nuclear one. Well, if you want to say that Godzilla advances an anti-American attitude in that the Japanese are innocent victims of nuclear tests run by the Americans, that's a coherent and plausible reading of the film, and I generally stand behind it. It seems to capture a fair bit of what attracted Japanese audiences to the story. But, it's still just a reading. We're back to that subtext versus text issue. Any anti-American attitude you think you can find in this involves an interpretation of subtext. At no point is America ever mentioned. We know, as a matter of history, that the H-bomb test near Japan was an American one. But that's knowledge you have to bring into the film from your own external experiences. There's no depiction of the H-bomb test, no direct discussion of it, even in the material cut from the American edition. And since that reading is all about subtext, then all the material you'd need to come to that reading exists in the American cut. None of the changes remove that reading as an option from this version. In fact, there have been critics who picked up on it without even knowing, much less having ever seen, the longer cut. In the end, what I think you can say about those cuts is that they involved scenes in which the main characters didn't appear. The Japanese version runs 90-plus minutes, which was too long for the double feature arrangement that it was destined for in America, too long for a TV slot. The U.S. distributors needed to cut it down, and naturally enough started by trimming scenes that didn't involve the main cast and weren't essential for following the plot. With these changes, Godzilla King of the Monsters made $2 million in its 1956 theatrical run. I could try to convert that figure into inflation-adjusted dollars today, but I'm not gonna. Leaving it as $2 million is already amazing enough. By making that kind of money, Godzilla joined a club so elite and exclusive it's almost unfathomable. Only 3 times before, in the entire history of movies, had a foreign film made that big of an impact in American popular culture. Forget the fact that this was the first time a Japanese movie had ever found commercial success in the U.S. That's thinking too small. This was the 4th time ever since Thomas Edison and Louis Lumiere first competed for bragging rights for inventing moving pictures that a foreign film had grossed even $1 million in the U.S. The other 3 were Italian neo-realists. It's no coincidence that all 4 were handled by Joseph Levine. But this achievement has rarely been celebrated as it's due. The film critical establishment has always been a little embarrassed about Godzilla crashing their party. You can make a big deal over what a great work of cinema Bicycle Thieves is. That's okay. But people like me, who make the claim that Godzilla is a work of art, face inevitable snickers and snide comments. Some of that's due to the fact that Godzilla is a science fiction movie about a giant monster, and those trappings are going to get in the way of a lot of critics who just won't be able to see past that. But there's something else. Godzilla stands at a pivot point in film history. It's the fork in the road where 2 paths diverged. In 1956, it was possible for someone like Joseph Levine and his track record with Italian art movies to approach Godzilla with the same sensibility and bring it out to a mass audience. After 1956, all of the decisions associated with this project would start to carry a different set of connotations. 2 things happened around the same time. The first of these was the rise of Bryant Halliday. He was a middling actor of minor talent and lesser renown. Don't worry if you've never heard of him before. There aren't Bryant Halliday film festivals. But wait, there are. It's called the Criterion Collection. You see, in addition to being an actor, Halliday was a connoisseur of fine movies. Where someone like Joseph Levine saw films as commodities from which to maximize profits, Halliday saw films as cultural artifacts that should be treated to the best, most respectful presentation. And if that respectful treatment meant that they would become less accessible to the masses, Halliday didn't mind. The point was to do right by the film. And he put his money where his mouth was. He co-founded Janus Films and more or less created the art house film circuit as we understand it today. And in the sense that Janus formed the backbone of the Criterion Collection, Halliday's influence continues to dominate the high-end appreciation of film art in this country. So I said there were 2 things that changed. The first is that whatever leaning there may have been in the 1950s towards finding ways to make foreign films populist and mainstream, that fleeting moment passed, and the art house circuit became the way by which serious, imported films were received in the U.S. Meanwhile, the other part of our story, the second thing that happened, was the lesson the exploitation film community took from Godzilla's success. The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms had cost about $200,000 to make and taken Ray Harryhausen months to animate. Levine, Goldman, and the other partners in Transworld had about $125,000 invested in Godzilla. Now, of course, it cost a great deal more than that to make, but that's how much it cost them. And before they'd had to put a single penny into it, they'd already had a chance to see the quality of it and see that Tsuburaya had made terrific special effects. Given that Beast from 20,000 Fathoms and Godzilla appealed to similar audiences, filled the same market niche, Godzilla was clearly the better investment. If you wanted to do more like Beast, you'd have to funnel large sums of cash to Ray Harryhausen or one of the other handful of people in the world with his skills, and then wait an incredibly long time. It made a whole lot more sense to go back to Toho with smaller sums of cash and buy ready-made special effects from Tsuburaya. Almost immediately, various members of the investment team that handled Godzilla reconfigure in different forms and go back to the same well, striking deals with Toho for 4 further projects to follow in Godzilla's footsteps. And the plan was not to fix anything that wasn't broke. They intended to buy finished films from Toho and then remake them as American projects with new footage they'd shoot stateside and fit in around whatever of the Japanese material they wanted to keep. What were these 4 follow-ups? One was the official Godzilla sequel, Godzilla Raids Again, which Toho had cranked out in Japan even before the American rendition of Godzilla King of the Monsters had been conceived. Plans were afoot to recycle its special effects material into a new, semi-American production entitled The Volcano Monsters. At the same time, the same group commissioned Varan the Unbelievable from Toho to meet certain specifications. That group, however, disintegrated before either project was completed, so the Volcano Monsters was never made, and the originally intended version of Varan wasn't made. Instead, the Japanese material went onto the market for new buyers, and both were refashioned for American audiences after all, but under slightly different circumstances than planned. While that was going on, the King brothers joined forces with some of the former Transworld investors to get U.S. rights to Rodan, the first giant monster film that Toho made in color. The King brothers had mostly produced film noir in the 1940s and early 1950s. They were dipping their toes into the water for producing their own monster film, which they would do in 1960, called Gorgo. Their handling of an Americanized adaptation of a Japanese monster film was a transitional step for them in feeling confident to produce Gorgo from scratch. And lastly, there was a 1955 sci-fi thriller that Ishiro Honda directed called The Abominable Snowman, which was turned into the John Carradine starring B-movie Half Human.
Due to the repeated experiments of H-bombs.
The pattern had now been set. There was an audience for Japanese monster movies in the U.S., but that audience would be reached only through an intermediary. Toho's films would be granted export visas only if they had some agent over here ready to Americanize them in some way.
We want to know what's being done about this monster. Well, here's your headline.
Okay, let me pull all this together for you. I said 2 things happened. The prospects of imported films in the U.S. now had 2 and only 2 tracks. Track 1 was the art house circuit, a la Janus Films. Since they were taking the very cream of the crop of the imports, that was pretty much foreclosing the notion of treating foreign films as equal competitors to Hollywood films, as Levine had tried to do. Serious, artistically respectable films now had a path into art houses and nowhere else. Meanwhile, the slummier end of things now had a vibrant market going for science fiction and horror films that would be treated like organ donors for American exploitation films. Teenagers liked monsters. Monsters were hard to produce economically. The Japanese did it economically, so American B-movie distributors outsourced the manufacture of their monsters to Japan. And here's why I'm bothering to lay this all out for you. In 1956, when the folks behind this movie decided to turn Godzilla into Godzilla King of the Monsters and add Raymond Burr to it and move the scenes around, that choice at that time represented an act of respect for the source material, a belief in its ability to find a mass audience, even though no Japanese film had ever done so before. The choice to dub it rather than subtitle it was a considerable extra investment from a man who sincerely believed this was how you do it right. But what came later, the endless reconfiguring of Honda's films into altered American forms, that exists in a different context. When you get to the 1960s and Toho's become a factory for making science fiction spectacle, and the production team is proving their mastery of the form over and over again, you kind of start to wonder how come they're not being allowed to just do it without interference. That being said, if you take the entire output of Japanese monster movies from the 30-year span of the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, you can break them down into 2 categories. The ones that went through significant alterations by American distributors, and those that were left pretty much untouched and unchanged. You could break them down into 2 different categories, the ones that were profitable and popular versus the ones that faded quickly into oblivion. And guess what? The 2 lists would be the same. The films that were tampered with did much better theatrically here. The ones that were unadulterated were flops. Now, that's just a correlation. It's not causation. What it means is up for interpretation. One possible explanation is that the distributors knew what they were doing. The changes wrought on the Japanese originals were necessary to make them appropriate for American tastes. Another possible explanation is that the process of changing things cost money, more than just a straight-up dub job, so that those companies that had the deeper pockets to finance that kind of editorial revision were also the ones with better distribution networks and publicity budgets, and the improved results reflect those larger financial truths more than anything else. A third possibility is that we see the most extreme tampering in the 1950s and the least intrusive changes in the 1970s, so what we're really tracking is how the genre was enjoyed when it was new and then grew stale over time. The American version also alters Serizawa's reluctance to use the oxygen destroyer. In the Japanese cut, the issue was that he feared his discovery being used by the military and notes with disgust the existing arms race. One of the famous lines from the Japanese dialogue is when Serizawa says, A-bomb versus A-bomb, H-bomb versus H-bomb. In this version, he articulates his dread as a fear of the oxygen destroyer falling into the wrong hands. The difference is subtle but telling. Honda's Serizawa didn't think any hands were the right hands, and therefore there weren't any specific wrong hands. This attitude differed quite significantly from the American perspective on the arms race, which did distinguish between right and wrong hands. From the American perspective, the Soviet Union was undeniably an inscrutable and seemingly unstable foe, which had nuclear weapons technology and an avowed intention to destroy everything America valued. Opposing such an enemy through traditional diplomacy was unlikely at best, and opposing it with traditional military force was certainly impossible. The only thing that remained was an ever-escalating nuclear arms program intended to keep the Soviet Union locked in a stalemate. Paradoxically, to preserve peace, America felt it had no choice but to prepare for war, to design machinery capable of destroying the world as a necessary precondition for saving the world from that very fate. And we need not be shy about admitting the additional fact that the growing military-industrial complex was deeply invested in nuclear arms and stood to gain financially by a booming defense budget. In summary, American policy was firmly committed to nuclear weaponry, and as such was primed to view all opposition to nuclear technology as being, by definition, anti-American. In Japan, opposition to nuclear proliferation was seen as fundamentally humanistic in principle, a reflexive position any right-thinking person would affirm. The MacArthur-authored Constitution did away with the Japanese military, so the country had no significant defense industry of its own. Additionally, Japan had been on the receiving end of the only atomic bombs ever used on humans. There's a discrepancy here. And since the Serizawa oxygen destroyer plot is all about attitudes about the Cold War arms race, this cultural gap would be revealed in the different versions of the film. In American Monster on the Loose movies, a scientist is usually the agent for bringing the monster into the world through some experiment gone awry. The monster then is punishment for toying in God's realm. Although Godzilla is the result of man's nuclear experiments, none of the researchers responsible for the Bikini Island H-bomb tests ever appear in the film. Nuclear testing is clearly the villain of the movie, even in the sanitized American version, but responsibility for nuclear testing is displaced to some anonymous off-screen party. Whether the viewer concludes that all humanity shares responsibility or that the Americans hold sole responsibility, the fact remains that none of the characters in this film have any direct, specific responsibility. Imagine a Frankenstein movie in which Dr. Frankenstein is not among the cast. Toho made such a film, but that's another story. The Japanese have to date never willingly acknowledged much responsibility for the Second World War. The bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki may or may not have resulted in less loss of life than had the war continued with conventional weapons. I'm not much inclined to open up that debate. My point is just that the Japanese have traditionally viewed these as unprecedented attacks on innocent civilians. Godzilla serves as a convenient metaphor for the Japanese view of these tragic and traumatic events. Godzilla's violence is directed at innocent parties who carry no responsibility for the punishments they suffer. Notice how this version has resequenced events. We've seen the first glimpse of Serizawa's oxygen destroyer before Yamane has articulated his belief that Godzilla should be studied, not killed, and before Godzilla makes his first appearance here near mainland Japan. From the perspective of the American filmmakers, this probably worked better as conventional narrative structure. The oxygen destroyer is what's going to save the day. It's going to be crucial for the conclusion of the film, so traditional notions of good screenwriting would have you introduce it early in the story. You don't want it to appear as a sudden revelation at the end, a sort of narrative get-out-of-jail-free card. From that standpoint, it probably looks like Honda's version is sloppily put together. The oxygen destroyer is only properly introduced when it's about to be used. But Honda's version is principally concerned with keeping the characters and the audience in a state of tension between opposing viewpoints, maintaining an ambiguity. It follows the logic of a person trapped in an impasse. Godzilla's a threat. No, he should be studied. Except Godzilla's an even worse threat than we thought. But he can't be stopped. Oh, but wait, yes, he can. Oh, but maybe the thing that can stop Godzilla is even worse. And so on and so on. This version is greatly simplified and has no time to second-guess its trajectory. An irony of all this is that because the American cut has this gung-ho attitude, it happily keeps all this footage of the Japanese military, heroically bracing for a fight. Now, we're just a decade away from vilifying the Japanese as the enemy. This is the 1950s we're talking about. A fair number of people in the audience of this film had killed Japanese people in the war and been honored for it. But here, without so much as blushing, this movie presents the Japanese army as good guys, while it was the Japanese cut that colored those scenes with hints of ambiguity and doubt. However, I'll admit to being of two minds as to the merit of this change. By compressing the film and moving Serizawa's big scene to earlier, this cut causes Godzilla's landfall to occur much sooner after his appearance in the bay. The other edition let its characters breathe and settle back down after the jarring sight of Godzilla near the shore. Lives go back to normal, the tension dissipates, and then he comes ashore. This version doesn't let the air out between those two scenes, which does keep the temperature up.
I couldn't tell Dr. Serizawa about it.
This is the start of the first of two sustained special effects sequences depicting Godzilla's incursions into the mainland. This is what you paid for. All the other stuff, the wartime references, the atomic age allegories, the careful manipulation of audience sympathy between incompatible viewpoints, the romantic triangle, none of that's going to hook you if you don't enjoy this. Godzilla rises or falls based on these two sequences. And in fact, maybe your ability to appreciate Godzilla on any level would be predicated on your reaction to these scenes. Donald Ritchie, the critic most singularly responsible for building an American audience for Japanese film, seemed to enjoy this aspect of the film. Ritchie said of Godzilla that, quote, "There are so many long, talky scenes that the monster's appearance becomes positively welcome. It's fun to watch the man walking on the toy buildings." Now, this strikes me as rather ironic. Of all people, I'd have expected Ritchie to have been more appreciative of Godzilla's subtext, its humanist values, its coded presentation of the Japanese experience of World War II and the Cold War aftermath. These are the very values he admires in other films, like Kurosawa's Record of a Living Being, but he doesn't even seem to notice them here, distracted by the man in the rubber suit. It's a monster movie, so he lowers his expectations and misses the forest for the guy smashing all the trees. Ritchie also wrote some interesting things about the special effects, and since I disagree with them, I'm going to share them with you now. He wrote that the effects were, quote, much more realistic than most movies of its type, but then added, quote, "The implicit fault is that no matter how well made the miniatures are, they still look unreal. Here they are extremely well done and look precisely like extremely well done miniatures." This is what I want to unpack. We've analyzed what the story means. Now it's time to see what the model miniatures mean. When the Japanese version of Godzilla opened, Toho had advertised it with publicity that promised that it would have special effects that surpassed Hollywood. Now, maybe that kind of boast elicits a giggle from you now, but if it does, I challenge you to make sure that you're looking just at this film, not thinking about any subsequent Godzilla movie, and if you're being fair and considering this film alone, and then also take care to compare it to genuine American peers of the time. You have to put yourself in the mindset of what this would have been like for a viewer in 1956 to experience. What would it be like at that point in time? And the startling realization is, not only does Eiji Tsuburaya's work hold up remarkably well against the competition, but what competition? I mentioned before that there are critics who slam this particular Americanized cut of Godzilla as taking Ishiro Honda's allegorical work and stuffing it into the clothes of a run-of-the-mill monster movie. The biggest problem with that statement is that when this was made, there really wasn't such a thing as a run-of-the-mill monster movie. King Kong and Beast from 20,000 Fathoms had set a standard and established a template, but nobody else was following that pattern yet. King Kong's re-release was in 1952, Beast from 20,000 Fathoms was in 1953. The other big science fiction films to come out of Hollywood in 1953 were It Came from Outer Space and War of the Worlds, alien invasion films. War of the Worlds has some of the flavor of a giant monster film in its depiction of cities laid waste by an implacable foe, but It Came from Outer Space is very modest in its effects and scope. In 1954, you get The Creature from the Black Lagoon, with one single man-sized monster played by an actor in a rubber suit, whose destruction and havoc is more psychological than physical. No cities laid waste there. 1954 also saw Them, probably the closest living relative to Godzilla in the U.S., aside from Beast. The giant ants in Them are full-scale mechanical models, sort of like enormous puppets. And while Them is a terrific piece of science fiction drama and well-made all around, I wouldn't go promoting it on the basis of its special effects. Them represented the onset of a new wave of monster movies, and so along with Them and Godzilla, around the same time, 1955, you get It Came from Beneath the Sea, in which Ray Harryhausen animated a giant octopus attacking San Francisco, and Tarantula, in which footage of a real tarantula was superimposed onto other shots to make it look enormous. Let's go ahead and complete the survey through 1956, the year that this version of Godzilla appears in American theaters. Its competition included The Creeping Unknown, which was the Americanized edition of the Hammer horror The Quatermass Experiment, with a human-sized monster a la Creature from the Black Lagoon. Roger Corman's The Day the World Ended had a rubber-suited monster whose psychotronic ridiculousness pretty much speaks for itself. Another Ray Harryhausen film, Earth vs. the Flying Saucers, with animated spaceships. Invasion of the Body Snatchers, Monsters Look Like Us. And Forbidden Planet, where the monster's invisible. In short, between the 1952 King Kong reissue and when Godzilla King of the Monsters showed up in 1956, there was almost nothing beyond the continued excellence of Mr. Harryhausen against which Eiji Tsuburaya's work could even be compared at all, much less to say anything about making that comparison favorably or unfavorably. Now, of course, over the decades that followed, Godzilla movies and Tsuburaya and Japanese monsters overall came to be associated with schlockiness and camp to the extent that the name Godzilla connoted bad dubbing and rubber-suited stuntmen play-acting at professional wrestling moves. The passage of time would contribute to the deracination of the Godzilla brand, but I have something to say about that as well. I mentioned that Toho struggled at first to find the right way to mimic the success of this film, and that the first round of follow-ups were treated to aggressive Americanization here. Varan, Half-Human, Rodan, and Godzilla Raids Again. Even if you see those in their original Japanese form, though, you're probably going to be disappointed. Not with Rodan, I would hope, which is great fun, but the other three are no more than adequate. They don't live up to the standards set by this picture, and certainly don't surpass it. Well, then, along came a writer named Shinichi Sekizawa, and when he joined the team, everything changed. He brought with him a childlike sense of wonder and a wicked sense of humor, and the monster movie screenplays he started writing were gloriously absurd. Instead of trying to make brooding apocalyptic allegories like this film, Sekizawa wrote playful, family-oriented fantasies. Inspired by his writing, Eiji Tsuburaya took to injecting more and more comedy and personality into the special effects scenes, and that proved to be the winning formula. By winning formula, I mean that the special effects extravaganzas made by Toho in the 1960s were insanely profitable, internationally beloved, and remain enduringly entertaining. Not many films reach those heights. Now, admittedly, that so-called winning formula also included patently ridiculous ideas of monsters arguing with each other and living on Monster Island, self-consciously campy moments, and various other silly attributes that make them somewhat harder to defend as works of art. I can stand here in all seriousness and make my case as to why Ishiro Honda's 1954 Godzilla is an artistic masterpiece, and as long as I emphasize all the allegorical connections, the references to the Lucky Dragon incident or Honda's experiences as a POW, as long as I stress the Akira Kurosawa overlaps and the pedigree of the various creators, I can make my case credibly. If I want to go out on a limb and defend this American cut as a worthy alternative, it's a slightly more uphill battle, but I can make po-faced arguments and not risk my own credibility. But defending the artistry of things like Ghidra the Three-Headed Monster, which I've done, by the way, is another thing altogether. Cultural critics have an easier time accepting that something dark and brooding and ominous is art. But if it's fluffy and funny, then no go. How many times has the Oscar for Best Picture gone to a comedy? A moment ago, I made a point of comparing Tsuburaya's effects here against the early 1950s American peers. Well, let's open that up now and compare these effects against everything that came later, the whole history of special effects. How do they hold up now? A filmgoer's perception of whether special effects look good has a lot to do with their expectations going in. Their perception is culturally informed. Let me give you an example to prove my point. Consider the 1976 remake of King Kong, in which Rick Baker realized his King Kong using a guy in an ape suit like Godzilla. It was the same technique that Tsuburaya used, and yet Rick Baker won the Academy Award for special effects that year for it. Audiences and critics today almost universally look back on that film with embarrassment. Nobody would put it forward as an example of special effects artistry now. I remember seeing it in 1976, and audiences thrilled to it. It was, at that time, a standard bearer for effects. As the years went on, that bar got raised, and in hindsight, the movie slipped in esteem significantly. I had occasion to watch Jason and the Argonauts recently with a young audience, and when that show-stopping sequence came on in which the armies of skeletons rose up from the ground to sword-fight our heroes, my heart beat a little faster and I craned forward in my seat, while the kids in the audience just laughed and said, "That's so fake." Well, it didn't look fake before. I mean, no more so than any image of a sword-fighting skeleton is going to look fake by definition. But today's viewers have become accustomed to seeing a level of digitally enhanced photorealism that now creates a different viewing context for those same images. What was once awe-inspiring now looks fake, without at any point changing what it looks like in any objective way. Okay, so that's a rambling way of establishing something that may already be obvious, that whether something looks realistic or convincing is not an objective fact, but a perception that's affected by circumstances. And one of the circumstances that affects how you perceive a film is your culture. We as American filmgoers are generally cultured to expect realism. A kid saying, "That's so fake," is expressing a pejorative opinion in our culture. But other cultures have other norms. Japanese art and theater have developed along highly stylized and abstracted lines. If you're watching a no play and griping, "That's so fake," you're just missing the point. And it's no wonder that a culture that is so steeped in abstract expressionism and ethereal stylization tends to value fantasy in their films. During the production of one of the more recent Godzilla sequels in 2001, Godzilla, Mothra, King Ghidorah, Giant Monsters All-Out Attack, that's the title, I didn't come up with it, don't blame me. Two of the film stars were watching some of the older Godzilla films from the 1960s as preparation. So these two stars, Shiro Sano and Chihiro Niyama, sat and watched King Kong vs. Godzilla together. And Chihiro Niyama did what a lot of people do. She started to giggle. And her co-star, Shiro Sano, shouted her down. He said, "Look, you're laughing because those look like toy tanks, right? Did it ever occur to you how much easier it would have been for Tsuburaya to go out and shoot some real footage of real tanks? He could have done that in a day and been done with it. But his team spent months handcrafting those miniatures and fitting them with tiny motors and lighting a miniature set dressed with miniature streetlights and miniature foliage. The effort and craftsmanship that went into making that tank look vaguely unreal is almost incomprehensible. The whole point is to give it that handcrafted look." I agree with Sano completely. It's like going into a museum and complaining that the portraits aren't as accurate as photographs would be. It's a true statement, but it implies an assumption that absolute reproduction of reality was the desired result. Yes, if you want to perfectly capture what something looks like, a photograph is better than a painting. But the advent of photography didn't kill off painting as an art form because there are other aspects of life beyond literal visual reality that artists and art lovers find meaningful. To go back to what Donald Ritchie was saying, the miniatures are indeed, in and of themselves, part of the joy. Recognizing that they are miniatures should not upset you or detract from the fun. If the only thing you want out of this is literal photorealism, then recognizing them as miniatures breaks the illusion. But if you find the miniatures artistically satisfying in their own right, there's no illusion to break. Same image, different perceptions. There's an anecdote that Bill Warren tells in his book, Keep Watching the Skies. There was this hugely expensive Japanese-American co-production in 1980, a film called Virus, directed by Kinji Fukusaku. The producers had spent lavishly to get an American cast. Glenn Ford, Robert Vaughn, Chuck Connors, Olivia Hussey, and they ponied up for an American special effects firm. Well, the Rushes come back from the special effects scenes and Fukusaku exploded. "I can't use this. This looks terrible. These scenes are too realistic." And so he hired a Japanese firm to redo all the effects at great expense to make them less realistic. And I think that pretty much says it all.
Part of Tokyo into a sea of fire. Beneath the flames, thousands lie dead or dying.
The addition of Raymond Burr's narration into the sequence takes what was already terrific and makes it arguably better. Say what you will about the rest of the American alterations, but Burr's speeches here are chilling and memorable. There's something else his speeches do. They emphasize how impotent he is. In the Japanese version, Ogata is the ostensible hero, but he's a weak character who contributes little to the proceedings. Raymond Burr's character displaces him here, but ends up even more marginalized than Ogata. Burr literally does nothing in the film but stand around and watch. And here he is, a bystander at the end of the world, watching in despair, unable to do anything about it.
This is it, George. Steve Martin signing off from Tokyo, Japan.
His speeches serve to make Godzilla's rampage even more unstoppable. Not even the American hero can save the day this time. The Americanization of Godzilla strips it of its foreign patina. This isn't a story about bad things happening to other people. The whole point of the dubbing and the insertion of Raymond Burr is to get us to identify with the Japanese characters and experience the terror of Godzilla personally. Weirdly, although these changes were meant to bridge the gap between Japanese film culture and American film culture, the Terry Morse version of the film managed to connect Godzilla to international audiences. When Goldman made his deal with Toho, his $25,000 license fee covered the United States and Canada. He barely had the distribution network to cover that territory and had no reason to imagine he'd need anything more. The enormous commercial success of Godzilla King of the Monsters attracted foreign attention, and suddenly, buyers from across Europe were calling up to strike deals. Goldman's multi-way partnership with Levine, Kay, and Ross had been given the name Trans World Enterprises. Trans World and Toho renegotiated their contract to provide the altered American cut to European companies. So, in the late 1950s, you could see local variants in which Raymond Burr had been dubbed into French, Italian, Spanish, and so on. What we know is that this film was so powerful in its day that foreign audiences clamored hungrily to see it, which prompted some variant editions that tried to reconfigure the 1954 Japanese movie into forms better suited for other markets. Yet this movie is still powerful today, such that here we are, more than 50 years later, still clamoring hungrily for it and finding those local variants no longer suit our markets. Instead of complaining about how folks like Terry Morse changed the movie, that's in the past, man. We should be marveling that even with his changes, Godzilla found its audience and then did so again, and again, and again, and again. While we're in the business of benchmarking Godzilla against the American competition, one more thing to note. In the commentary to the 1954 Japanese original, I said that Godzilla's attack on Tokyo is an apocalyptic vision darker and more nightmarish than any comparable sequence in King Kong, The Lost World, Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, Mighty Joe Young, or even Them, any of the giant monster movies America had produced prior to 1954. But in the period between 1954 and 1956, that context changed a bit. What had changed was a growing audience for apocalyptic science fiction in the United States. The Cold War arms race had set Americans on edge. They were building bomb shelters and teaching their kids to duck and cover. The end of the world seemed increasingly real and imminent, and this was naturally reflected in popular culture. What Japanese audiences saw in 1954 was a relatively unprecedented sequence of horror. What American audiences saw in 1956 was more in step with popular sci-fi. Same image, different perception. We've closed the loop on the flashback and cycled back to where we came in, which is a nice story structure. The worst of Godzilla's violence is contained in the flashback, although we don't know that yet. All we know is that our narrator has barely survived the events so far, and what comes next is anyone's guess. How are they going to get out of this one? This sequence includes the most significant interaction between Raymond Burr and the rest of the cast. Kudos to Terry Morse for editing this material so carefully to give off a fairly convincing illusion of them all being in the same room at the same time. Good uses of body doubles and replica costumes to get the reverse angles and matching shots to work out. This is why Morse, as a trained editor, was in the best position to take on a job like this. Raymond Burr makes a big impression in this film despite having limited screen time and such tangential interaction with the other characters. There's another film from the same period about which you could say the same thing. Rear Window. Burr had toiled in the B-movie crime thriller realm for a long time, typecast as bad guys and one cheapie after another, and then he got a break on Alfred Hitchcock's masterpiece. It was still a supporting role, it was still playing a bad guy, seen at a distance through a window. But if you appear on a masterpiece, no matter what your contribution, there are glories to be reaped. Burr's role in Rear Window was a surprisingly nuanced and sympathetic kind of killer, and it suggested untapped talents in the actor. Seeking to capitalize on this breakthrough, Burr and his agent Lester Salko formed their own company, Bursall Productions, with the aim of producing 3 independent features that Burr would write for himself. Such ambitions quickly sputtered out, but it showed how this point in Burr's life was a turning point. And it was right smack dab in the middle of all of this that Burr got the gig on Godzilla, all while his name was being bandied about in the gossip rags as being the latest boyfriend of Natalie Wood. Okay, I'll let you clean up from having just spat out your coffee. You heard me right. Natalie Wood and Raymond Burr out on the town night after night. Wood was a famously gregarious actress, and she was co-starring with Burr in a 1956 crime thriller called Cry in the Night. It could have been just one friendly star spending time with a co-worker. Coulda, but wouldn't. The gossip columns were not sure what to make of their dates and portrayed the relationship as one of the worldly older man tutoring his younger protege, like Professor Higgins and Eliza Doolittle. Wood's closest friends knew better than that. Natalie described their relationship as a genuine romance and dropped hints to the columnists that they were to be married soon. When the executives at Warner Brothers heard that their 17-year-old ingenue was dating a man twice her age, and not just that, but the man who played her rapist in Cry in the Night, the PR alarms went into DEFCON 4. Studio officials were sent to the set to keep the two apart, but Natalie insisted on continuing to see Raymond secretly. The biggest obstacle to their relationship, however, was not the age difference or studio interference, but the simple fact that Raymond Burr was gay. One couldn't be open about such things in those days, and some cynics wonder if Burr merely used his younger co-star as a beard to disguise his sexual orientation. Burr's partner, Robert Benavides, however, says that Raymond told him that he really loved Natalie. Certainly, even a gay man would find much to enjoy in the company of a charming young woman like Natalie Wood. Basically, the simple and lovely truth of it was that Burr and Wood were safe in each other's company. She'd been sexually exploited already, too many times for a girl of her age, and remained vulnerable to the predations of the powerful men in her life. And Burr's career was threatened should his true self be known. The closet in those days was deep and dark. Their brief affair, whatever it was a safe haven for each of them. And if Wood was famously friendly, Burr was famously warm and generous. In the years to come, there would be American actors hired by Toho to appear alongside the Japanese cast to help pre-Americanize their monster movies, and folks like Russ Tamblyn and Joseph Cotten would accept the job cynically, contemptuous of the silly stuff they were called on to do. By contrast, Burr spent his entire professional life defending Godzilla proudly. He later claimed that he'd have been willing to do the scenes in this film virtually for free had he been allowed to profit share in the result. He foresaw the enduring success of Godzilla and wanted in. 30 years later, he was invited back to be a part of the Americanization of the 30th anniversary Godzilla film, Godzilla 1985. His friends and advisors all assumed he'd reflexively reject the offer. He was a genuine star by then, riding high on TV's return of Perry Mason. He no longer needed to accept whatever scraps he was given, as he had back in the 1950s. But Burr surprised everyone by taking the Godzilla 1985 role and then taking it incredibly seriously. The producers of that Americanization had even more grandiose plans for reconfiguring and remaking the American edition, and Burr blocked many of them, saying that they were untrue to the spirit of the Japanese original. No matter how big and famous he got, Burr never condescended to Godzilla, never giggled.
Then you have a responsibility no man has ever faced. You have your fear, which might become reality. And you have Godzilla, which is reality.
I love that line. That's possibly my favorite line in the whole movie. Did you notice how hard it is to distinguish between Ogata and Serizawa's voices? Close your eyes and try to figure out which one is speaking. It's the same voice actor for both roles, a man named James Hong, who went on to become one of Hollywood's most familiar Asian faces. Listen carefully, he's Kung Fu Panda's Mr. Ping. Now, there was only one other male voice actor, Sammy Hong, no relation. The two had been chosen by virtue of being of Asian descent and therefore having accented voices. It's been a long-standing debate in the dubbing industry how to handle the issue of accents. The prevailing view has traditionally been that you want an identifiable Asian accent associated with Asian characters because it would be jarring to have a voice that didn't seem to fit the actor. The idea being that you're trying to give the audience the impression that this is really that actor speaking, as if the film had been shot in English and the Japanese cast was doing their game best to talk in English. Of course, that net ends up being cast wide. Chinese actors are cast as voices for Japanese actors, even though Chinese accents don't sound like Japanese accents, and in the end there's a certain racism to all this. If the characters were talking in English, why wouldn't their English be perfect? How come? It's a tough call. I've always had a soft spot for the dubbing that Toho commissioned in the 1970s from a Hong Kong company where the voice actors had pronounced Australian accents. It never struck me as anomalous that the Japanese characters spoke with Australian accents. It was English, it made sense to my ears, the accent was still foreign of a sort. Maybe if I myself was Australian, I'd have felt differently. In 1959, Godzilla King of the Monsters began its life on television. It had by that point racked up $2 million theatrically, but there's only so far a theatrical release can ever get. There are only so many theaters, each one has only so many seats, there's only so many hours in a day. Eventually, the theater owner will want to run a different movie, so there's an upper ceiling on how much a movie can return on a theatrical run. But television syndication is less limited, and that television market proved to be an even bigger and more significant one than the theatrical market. Tell me the last time you saw a subtitled movie on terrestrial broadcast television. Dubbing opened up the opportunities for this film to have a longer life, to reach a wider audience. And speaking of reaching a wider audience through dubbing, this version, this Godzilla King of the Monsters featuring Raymond Burr, this was exported back by Toho and released in Japan with the English dubbing subtitled back into Japanese. Now, that may sound like absolute lunacy, but it gets worse. First, you've got the recursive aspects of Japanese dialogue being dubbed into English and then subtitled back into Japanese, which is like a game of telephone gone completely awry. And then on top of that, you've got the fact that not all of this film was dubbed into English, remember? There were all those scenes in the first half where Raymond Burr and Frank Iwanaga went around spontaneously translating the Japanese dialogue. But Terry Morse had cut scenes together however they worked visually. He took for granted that American viewers don't understand Japanese, so it didn't matter to him what kind of holy nonsense the Japanese dialogue turned into when he was done splicing things together. The alleged translations that Iwanaga gave were just what the narrative needed at that moment. They weren't actually translations at all. So the Japanese release of Godzilla King of the Monsters only bothers to subtitle the English bits. The Japanese dialogue was left alone. So there are scenes where the characters say complete non sequiturs, refer to events that haven't happened yet, have non-versations where the back and forth makes no sense, and then Iwanaga says, "Oh well, Dr. Yamane is saying they should go interview the Odo Islanders," and you just have to wonder what Japanese audience is made of that.
And now, the divers are descending. We ask the whole world to stand by.
And Honda's version endures, survives. Just as Godzilla survived the oxygen destroyer. There are decades more of Godzilla's adventures to unfold. Movie after movie, comic books, TV cartoons, video games, you name it. Godzilla survives because the idea spoke so deeply to so many people. And I'm one of them. I'm a Godzilla fan, and I have been since I was 6 years old. And being here with you to watch these movies together has been one of the great joys of that life. Thank you for sharing it with me. My name is David Kalat. Thanks, and good night.